Welcome to this quick start tutorial on creating boilerplate code for MERN stack web applications. This is a continuation of the Create React App quick start tutorial that can be found in the video description. You can either begin with that tutorial and come back to this one, clone the code from the GitHub repository that is linked in the description, or use your own method of creating a React app that is running on a server. Previously, we created a React frontend along with a server to run it on. We also added the code to a local repository, a GitHub repository, and deployed the app to Heroku. In this tutorial, we'll be adding the ability to communicate with a Mongodb database with CRUD commands. We can create a new item. We can read from the database of the item stored within the database. We can update an item within the database. And we can delete items within our database. Once we have finished implementing the Mongodb functionality within our app, we will commit the code to a local repository, push the code to GitHub, and deploy to Heroku. If you don't have the code that we created previously in the Create React App tutorial, we'll get started by going to GitHub. The link will be in the description, and download the React boilerplate code. Just download the zip. Then choose a directory that you'll want to store your project in. I'll just be using documents. We'll open up File Explorer to point to that, and we'll also open up what we've just downloaded. I'll just open this and drag the React boilerplate main code into where I want to store the app, and then I'll just rename this, just getting rid of the main. I'll copy the full path of this directory, and then I'll open a command prompt and then change directory cd into our folder that we'll be keeping our project in, and then I'll run the commands atom full stop to open atom within that directory. This is where we left off last time, except we don't have the node modules folders for either our main folder or our front end. So we can go back to our command prompt and type, while in the main directory, npm install. Then we need to cd change directory into the client folder, and then run the same command again, npm install. Ignore the vulnerabilities for now. I think it's because the Create React app has recently updated and all the fixes for the modules haven't caught up yet. We can change directory 1 back, so we're back in the React boilerplate directory, by typing change directory cd dot / two full stops and a /. When we're in our main directory, we can type npm run dev to run that particular script. We've started our server. We are displaying our app as we previously left it. We can close that for now and cancel the running of the server. We need to set up a Mongodb database, and for that we'll be using Mongodb Compass. So we need to open a browser and just type Mongodb Compass. We want to go to Mongodb Compass download. We want to then choose the on-premises Mongodb locally. We want a community server, and we'll just download this. Once the download is complete, we just run through the installation process. We'll just keep these as is for now. We'll finish the setup. Now hopefully we can just connect to localhost. We'll test this out soon, but first we should get a Mlab account. Once it is time to code, we have all the details we need to connect to both respective databases. We can type in Mlab in the search. Mlab.com. Sign up for an account. You should only need an email address. I'll log in. I've already got an account. So with MongoDB installed both locally and with our new database online, we can start our coding. I'm going to keep these open for now. Go back to our code, and we need to create a configure folder within our main folder. We'll call it config, and within config we need a new file called db.js. db.js will be the file that we use to connect to our databases, whether it's our local database or the one hosted on Mlab. We'll be using Mongoose for the connection, so we need to import that. And we also need to import config. We need to make sure we have these included in our dependencies also. So we need to go back to command prompt, npm install mongoose and also config. We'll go back to our package.json file, and we have config and mongoose modules now included. From here we can define a variable that will have our database configuration, which we'll define as db. We'll specify db to equal config.get, and we'll call this Mongo URI. This will be a variable which we haven't defined yet. It'll be in JSON format. We can create a file within our config folder called default.json. Set of curly braces, and within that we want to put within double quotes Mongo URI, and we'll define this as our local instance of our database. We'll go to Compass again. I've just disconnected from the database just to display what our connection will be. So it'll be localhost 27017. I'll just reconnect this. We wanted within double quotes, we want to define that it's going to be MongoDB. Then a colon, / we can type for localhost 127.0.0.1, another colon, and then our port number 27017. So this is the same as localhost, just in case you need clarification for that. We'll save this, and what should happen now, as we've imported config, it'll go to the config folder, look in default.json, find the Mongo URI variable we've specified, or key value pair, depending on how you want to look at it. It'll take the connection configuration, and we'll have that ready to go within database or DB. From here we can build a connection to that database that this variable is pointing towards. We'll type const, and we'll call this connect DB, which will be an asynchronous function. We'll type a try catch statement. If it catches an error, we'll log, console log, the error and the message associated with it. And then we'll exit the process with a 1. Within our try segment, we want to await the results of whether or not the Mongoose database connection was successful. We also want to set a few configurations. We want use new URL parser and set this to true. Use create index to true. Use find and modify false. And lastly, use unified topology. And this will be set to true. We also want to export the module. We want to make sure the module exports our connect.db. So just to clarify, we're setting a variable, we're giving it the URI that we require to connect to a database. We are trying to connect to that database. If it fails, it'll run this error. And if it succeeds, it'll set these parameters, which you don't really have to know what they do. I just know the code works. And we will then export our connect.db variable. Now this only connects to our local MongoDB setup, but we'll hold off for now and we'll get it to connect to our Mlab database, which we'll need once we've deployed to Heroku. From here, we need to update our server in order to get our database connection working. This should be as simple as importing our connection. We want to import connect db, require within this directory, we want to go to config and then db, which stored our connection. And then we simply have to access our connection by typing connect db brackets. We'll save this, and we need to also save our db.js. Now we'll go back to command prompt and see if our code works and we get a connection to the database locally. npm run dev. I've made a typo here. I'll save that and try again. Just press C to cancel all that. npm run dev. And it looks like everything was successful. Just to clarify that it is running successfully, I'm just going to cancel this. Go back to our db.js folder. And I'll just log a message. MongoDB connected. And save that. npm run dev in command prompt. And there's our connection. With our database and server configured correctly, we can move into creating a model for what we want to store on our database. Within our backend folder, a new folder, and call this models. Within the models folder, we'll create a file called item, uppercase I to indicate that it is a model, .js. Within our items model, we want to require mongoose again. And then we want to define our schema for item, const item schema, which will be a new schema, a new mongoose schema. Which will be an item, and it will item will have a name. The type will be of string, and it will be required. The item model will also require a date, which will be of the type date. And we'll set it to default to now, or whenever a new item is created. We'll export the model from the module. It will be a mongoose.model, and the parameters will be item, and then we want to export item schema. Item will be the name of whatever we are creating in terms of the model. So we are creating an item using the item schema. We'll save this. Now we want to create a route that will be the beginnings of our CRUD functionality, where we will utilize the item model. Within our main folder, we'll create a new folder called routes, and within the newly created routes folder, we'll create another folder called API. In API, we'll create a new file and call it items.js. This will be where we store all our routes to communicate with our database in regards to our items model. We'll start by requiring express. And we also need to access a router within express, so we'll type const router is equal to express, which we're accessing here, dot capital ROUTER. We'll first create the description of the test route that we're going to create. We'll put this in comments. At route, it will be a get route, and then we'll specify the route that we will access in order to run this test route. API items test at description DESC, just a description of what the route's going to do. Test item routes are connected, and the access will be public, meaning no one will have to log in or anything of that nature in order to access a route. So we'll access the router, and this will be a get route. We need to access API items test, but in a moment we'll be updating our server so we can automatically access the API/items. So all we have to do is type /test here to access this specific route. And for the second parameter, we'll create an asynchronous function with a request parameter REQ and a response parameter RES. We'll create a try-catch statement. For our catch, we'll return a response in JSON format, which will produce an key value pair of error, and we'll just type a string error. If everything runs successfully, we want to return a response RES. Again, JSON format. It'll be test, and we'll just type success. We also need to export the router from this module.exports is equal to router. We'll save this, and then we have to update our server. To update our server, we need to include the routes that we're going to be using. We'll type app.use, and then the parameter for the route that will access our items API, which will be API items. So basically the route will be localhost, port number, API items, and we'll specify test when we are actually making our route call. And we also require the routes that we just created. Which was routes/API/items. We'll save this. We should also add some middleware. App.use express.json. So with this server saved and our first testing route created. We'll go ahead and install Postman by opening a browser. Just search Postman, go to downloads at postman.com. Download again, I've already downloaded the file. Run through the installation process. Once you have Postman up and running, we'll just go ahead and test this route to see if everything's working correctly. We want a GET request at localhost. Port number 5000, because that is the port number of our server. We also need to have our server up and running, so if you don't do that now, make sure you're in our main folder, npm run dev. Now the route we want to access is API items. And then test. And we've made a successful GET call to this route. We'll go ahead back to our routes API items file, and now we're going to create the read portion of our CRUD command setup. We'll be creating two routes, one to get all items within our database and one to get one item based on its ID from the database. We'll start with getting all for starters. Again, we'll type our description out. This will be a GET request also at the route API items at description get all items, and our access will be public. Again, we access the router, we make a GET request. The route will simply be API items, so we'll just add a / here, and for a second parameter we'll do another asynchronous function. With a request response. Another try catch statement. In the event of an error, the response res status will set to 500, and we'll send the message server error. On a successful try, we'll set a variable called items, which will await a response of item.find, which will require us to import the model we have created here. So we'll go back up the top, we'll type const capital I for item TEM, models require. We need to go back to folders, to directories. We need to access models, and then we need to access items. So we'll type back, models, and then capital IT for item. That's important. So we've included the item within our items routes. We'll go ahead and look to find all the items within our database, and then after that we are going to respond in JSON format the items that were found. In order to be able to return items, we need to, of course, have the ability to add items to our database. So we'll create that route now. At route, which will be a post request at the same route, but since up here we've got a get request and a post request, depending on the type of request, the specific code based on that request will be run. The description, post a new item, and again the access will be public. We need to access router, make a post request this time at the same routes, API items, another async function with parameters request and results. In the event of an error, the response will be that of a status 500 again, and then we'll send the message of server error. In our try statement, we'll write const, and we'll set a variable which will equal a new item, and as each item requires a name, we must include that, which in JSON format will be name, to specify that whatever we put here will be inserted into this specific item, and the item name we will get from request body name. Then after that we need to make sure the new item is saved. So this, which contains our new item we just created, will then go on to be saved. So let's run back through. We've got our get request, which will find all items, but in order for us to be able to find items, we first need to post new items. So we'll create a new item with the name that we specify, and then we'll save that item to the database. We'll save this file. We'll go back to Postman. Now we'll create a new post route, which will be localhost. Again, if we access the API items with a post request, we're going to access this route. We also need to set our content type with under headers to application.json. Now, as our request body requires a name, so we can set this name within our item, we need to add JSON here. We need to make sure it's double quotes here, colon, and then whatever name we want. Let's say Apple. We'll check to see our server's running. Yes. We'll open Mongodb Compass. And we'll try this route. And we've got an item with the name Apple newly created. As you can see, this request is still running because we haven't really given it a point of where it knows it's been successful or not. I'll just cancel that. I'll go back to our post route for the items, and I'll just type res.json success true. We'll save that and see if this works better. We'll go back to our Postman route. We'll update the name for a new item. We'll call this pair. We'll send this. We've got a success true message. If we go back to Compass, we'll refresh, and we've got a second item called pair. We'll go back to Postman and we'll test our get route at API/items. So again, the last route was post. This route will be a get request. We'll hit send, and we've got both of the items we have created displaying retrieved from our database. So everything's running well currently. We go back to our code. We'll create our route that will retrieve one item based on the ID number that we give it. We'll give it a description. This will also be a get request. Now this route will be API items, and then we'll specify a specific item ID. The description will be get an item by ID, and again this will be accessed publicly. Access our router, again a GET request. Now here it'll be API items ID, so all we have to do is / ID, an asynchronous function, request results, try catch, in the event of an error will be response status 500, and we'll send the error we'll try for we'll try to set a variable const item which will be equal to await to find an item by the ID that will specify within the parameters of the route. So ID will be request params dot ID. Have the underline in front of it, because if we look within what is returned to us, ID within the database will have an underscore in front of the ID. We will also respond in JSON format with the item that we receive. We'll save this, we'll go back to Postman, we'll create our new route, localhost 5000 API items, then we need to specify the ID of the item we wish to retrieve. So we can go back to just our regular get all route. We'll copy and paste, let's copy and paste pairs ID. Just to clarify, we've got API/items, then API/items, then the ID. Let's see if this works. And we've retrieved that specific item based on the ID. So now we can create, we can read. All we need to do now is to be able to update and delete in order for us to complete our CRUD functionality via routes. We'll go ahead and we'll start on our update route, which will be a put request. again, we'll be accessing the specific item that we want to update via ID. So it'll be /ID. We'll create another asynchronous function. Try catch. Responsive status 500. Send. Server error. We first need to retrieve the specific item that we want to change via the ID that is specified. Const item will await to find an item by ID. Once we have that item located, we will set the name to its new name. The new name will be the one we specify within the request body when we make our puts call. We then need to await until it's saved. So we'll save this item after it's been changed, and then we'll return a response. And we'll just return the item as the response. We'll save this back to Postman, create a route with a put request. Let's change pair. Again, body raw. We'll change this to carrot. Sorry, we need our double quotes here. Both double quotes for the key and the value. Also within the header, we'll specify content type as application JSON. No, we haven't changed it yet. We've got pair here within our database. We'll make this request. And we've got a server error. I've made a mistake here. It's not find item by ID, it's find by ID. We'll save that. We'll try this request again. And now we have changed the item with that ID that was previously named pair to carrot. we'll just go to our database. This is because we haven't refreshed it yet. Same ID, different name. So with our updates routes complete, we can finish up with our delete route, and we will have all our CRUD functionality up and running. This will be a delete request. Delete an item. Access public. Access the router again. A delete request this time. We'll be accessing a specific item by ID. An async function with a request and a response. Try catch. A resulting error will be a response status 500. Send the message server error. Here we want to find a specific item by ID. Which will require us to await a response. The item number that we request will be within the params. And once we do have this item, we will delete one. We'll specify the ID again, just to be sure. I'm not sure if that's entirely necessary, as we are deleting one once we've retrieved the item, but we'll just do this anyway. And we'll type item return response.json item. We'll save this and give this a test. Let's delete Apple this time. We'll copy the ID from Apple. We'll go back to Postman and create our new delete route. We need to specify the ID of the item we want to delete, and we'll give this a test run. Okay, so we've returned the apple, which is what we wanted to do here. Let's go back to our database. We'll refresh, and as you can see, we only have carrots remaining. So everything appears to be successful at this point. Now we can actually get into creating a component that will allow us to display our CRUD commands within our React front end and test them out. We'll get started by, we'll clear up some space here. So let's begin creating our new component by navigating to client source component, and here we'll add a new folder and call it list. Within list, we'll create a new file and call it index.js. We'll import React from React, and we'll create a simple functional component called list. Here we'll just return a div with a h1 tag, and we'll just say list component, and then we'll export it. We'll save this and navigate to our app.js file within the source folder. This is a component we created in the previous tutorial. Under that, we'll add our list component. And just reference it here. We'll save this. I've closed down my server, so I'll just run the script to boot everything up again. npm run dev. And we are displaying our newly created component. We'll go back to our code. Go back to our list component. Now what we want to do is start accessing our routes in order to run CRUD commands. We first need to be able to read what we've stored in our database. We'll start by creating the ability to store whatever has been retrieved from the database into this component. We'll be using hooks to access and to store the data retrieved from the database. So we'll type const, we'll call this list data, and set list data. This isn't a tutorial on hooks. In a future video, I'll probably do something along those lines, but basically to access whatever list data is stored, we'll be referencing this, and to set what list data is storing, we'll be accessing set list data. We'll use state and we will be holding an array of items, so we'll call this items array. and just reference a blank array for the moment. We also need to require use state, which we can do by referencing it up here when we are importing React. So we've now created state for this component. We need to access the database both when the component is mounted and when the component is updated. First, we'll focus on when the component mounts. We'll create a new function, call it update items. Now we will be using a package called Axios in order to make HTTP requests in order to utilize our routes. So we'll say Axios, which we haven't imported yet, but we will in a minute. We want to call a GET request because if we remember, this is the route we want to access to retrieve all of our stored items within our database. We need to reference API items. So this will access localhost at 5000 / API items as a GET request. And then after a response is received, we will then use set list data to set the list data for the items array. So we'll call this function and then we'll update this array to hold whatever the response data returns. We also want to make sure that when we mount this component that we automatically retrieve the data currently stored on the database, which we can use a hook called useEffect. We want to create an arrow function here, and we will run this function to retrieve the data when the component mounts. We also need to specify when this component is going to fire. By adding the empty array here, this is the equivalent to a component did mount function within a class-based component. So basically we'll mount this component, this will be run, but it will not continuously run again, which will cause a infinite feedback loop. We'll test to see if our update items is fired once and only once when we do mount the component by within curly braces logging the contents of list data.array. We'll save this. We also need to import use effect like we did with use state. So we'll just add a comma and type use effect and save that. And we also need to add Axios to our dependencies. So I'll copy the full path of this. I'll open an additional command prompt, cd into that directory. We need to cd into our client folder. And we need to npm install Axios. I'll close this for now. We'll check in our package.json folder. Axios is included in our list of dependencies. We'll import Axios, capital A, from Axios and save that. Go back to our package.json file in our client folder. And right down the bottom, we'll add a comma after browse list, and we'll set the proxy server to our server port. We'll type http // localhost :5000. So now, rather than accessing localhost 3000, we are now accessing localhost 5000 in order to call our routes from our API. Save this. This should be items array. And now, as you can see, we've now got our component accessing whatever we have stored in our database. As we've only got one entry in our database for now, it's an array of one object. So that's successful. We'll create another function, const. We'll call this display list. We are going to map over list data items array. So we'll return list data dot items array dot map. This will map over all objects within our array once we've retrieved them from the database. We'll call each mapping a item, and then we'll return we'll create a new component to display here. We'll create this in another file. So within our list component, we'll create a new folder and we'll call it components. This will be components specific for the list component. Within the component folder we just created, new folder, and we'll call this item. And within the items, a new file, call it index.js. We want to again import React from React. This again will be a functional component called item. And we'll return the JSX that we create. We'll also do our export default item. Now for each item in the item array, we are going to create an item component. So we're going to map over the items array. For each item, we'll create a new items component. And for now, let's just use the name just to be able to display something. We'll set this as a prop. Item name is equal to item.name. From here, we'll create an item and we'll just return. We'll just use a paragraph tag, props dot item name. We also need to place this in curly braces, and we also need to include props in the parameter of the component. We'll save this. I'll get rid of the console log that we used in our previous step to display the contents of item array, and I'll replace it with curly braces and display list and call that function. We also need to import our item component, which is in components item. This needs to be a capital I. We'll see if this wants to work. And now we are displaying our one entry within our database as an item within our list component. We should also set a unique key for our mapping. We'll type key is equal to, with each item we also have the ID of that item, so we'll try to use that. We'll save this, refresh, and we no longer have that error message because we are now displaying a key for each item that we map over. Now with each item, I don't just want to send just the item name over to our items component. I want to send the entire item. So I'll just refactor this. So now we're sending the entire item over via props I'll just delete this for now, and we'll just display what our props is sending. So log props dot item. Need to get rid of that. I'll save this, and I'll save this also. Props is displaying an ID, the name and the date, which is what is retrieved from our database. So now we have access to all three of these, should we need them within our items component. I'll delete all of that, and then I'll create a div to store what we want to display within our item component. We'll first list the name of each item. We'll create another div and we'll display the item name. Now we want the ability to be able to add additional items via our list component. We'll leave our item component for now. We want to create yet another component called string input. Right click on the components folder within the list component, new folder, and we'll call this again string input. We'll create a new file and call this index.js. I'll just close down index.js of the items component and have the string input index.js file open. We want to import React again. We'll create our component called string input. Return the JSX, export default, string input, and here we want to create a form for both the input of the name and also the submit button. So we'll use a form tag. We'll define what happens when we press the submit button, so on submit. We'll just leave this blank for a second. We want this. We want the string inputs. And we also want a button. Type of submit. We'll just leave this for us for one moment. We have to import the string input component. time comes, we want to display it within our list component here. We'll save both these. And we've got a string input and a submit button displaying, but it is useless at the moment. We first need to define what happens when we type a string in here. What we want is it to constantly update with what the user types and store that within a variable. So we'll use component state by using the hook. We'll call this item data. Call this item data and set item data. Which will use state. And we'll just have this store a name. We'll set the type to name. We'll set the placeholder to item name. We'll set the name again to name. We'll set the value equal to item data name. And we'll also define an onChange function in a moment, which we'll just leave this blank for a second. Back within our input component, I'll just type out the code and then I'll give an explanation of how it works. We need to set type to name, placeholder to anything you wish. I'm going to call it item name. Name equal to name. The value equal to items data dot name. So just with curly braces. And onChange we'll set to a function that we'll create in a moment called onChange. We'll set our onChange function now. We'll type const onChange. This will be a function that takes in an event. We'll just call the event E. We'll access our set item data method. So we want to access item data. Then e.target.name within square braces and e.target.value. So here what we are doing is we've defined our text input, which is displaying here, the item name, text that you can see is from the placeholder. So for each character we type within our text box, the Unchanged function is going to update name with whatever value we have specified within that text box. So for example, when we've just mounted the component, it'll be empty because item data.name is currently empty. Let's say we type an A. Unchanged is going to be fired with the event, and the value that it currently holds is A. So we're going to access item data name. It will then access e.target.name, which is here. So essentially this will be name, and the value that we've updated will be A. Now, if we type an additional character, let's say B, the value was previously A and now it's AB. So on change, it's going to access name and update to our new string AB. Now with our value currently AB, it's going to display that value within our string. Let's say we delete the B. It'll call our function again, access item name, and update it to A. With that complete, we also need to define what we want to happen when we submit our form. So we want to take the name that we've defined within our text input and save that as a new item to our database. So we'll create a new function called onSubmit, which again will take in the event. Now we want to prevent what will happen by default when we submit the form, which will be re-rendering our component. So to prevent this, we'll call the event and then prevent default, which is a method. We'll console log just to be thorough of submitted. We have to make a post request again to our server. So we will need Axios again, which we've already included in our packages. We just need to import it into this file. So we'll call axios.post for post request. We want the route of API/items, which will bring us to this function. We also need to remember a / here. And we also require within our body the name of the item. And as we've added this via our text input, it'll be the value of item data.name. So to define this, we need name item data dot name. We'll make sure we have Compass open. Now currently within my database I've only got one entry, which was carrot. I've made a typo here, this should be lowercase. We also have to update our form to know what to do when the form is submitted, and we need to call this function. So we'll go down here and call on submit. I'll save this. Now I'll just type tomato and submit. We've got our submit message that we defined just here. We'll go back to our database, we'll refresh, and now we've got a new entry of tomato. So that's working well. I'll just add a value for the submit button to give it a different text explanation. We'll just write value, add item, and save that. That's updated. As you can see, just because we've added tomato does not mean it's going to display within our list component. In order to do that, we need to send instructions from list component to string inputs for it to determine what's going to happen after we do submit our form and create the new item. So in order to do that, as we've already created our update items component, we can send this as a prop to the strings component. So we'll add our props up here. And then once we've submitted our new item to be created with our name, we can then call props dot update items, which is again a function. Before I save this, I'll just go back here and just refresh this. We've got carrots and tomatoes. Because we've re-rendered the list, it's called update items, and the items array had updated to get both of our entries from the database. We also need within our string input to pass update items to our string input component. So we'll type update items within curly braces, the name of the function. So this will get sent via props here, which will allow us to call this once we've created a new item. We'll make sure everything's saved. We'll go to our database. We've currently got carrot and tomato within our database. I'll add pear, add item, it's submitted, and now we've got pear displayed. It's refreshing the items by calling the database again, resetting items array, and then displaying whatever items are within that array. Now from here we need to be able to update the names of each of our entries within the database. Go back to our code and we need to access the items component. We'll create an additional div in order to store a button which once clicked will give us access to a text input to be able to change the name of the item. We'll create a button, and this will just be a blank button for now. From there, we'll add the text update. What we want to do now is, once we've clicked the update button, have access to a text input form. In order to do that, we're going to have to recognize of whether or not we want to update a specific item. And for that, we can use local state within the item. So we'll go right back up to the top and import use state from React. As previous, we want to define the local state. We'll call this item data, and we'll also add the set item data function, which will use state, and within the state we want to determine whether or not we want to update the item. We'll set update to an initial value of false and save this. From here, back in our button, we want to add what will happen once we've clicked it. So we'll type onClick is equal to, we're going to use an anonymous function here. I'll explain why in a minute. Set item data and then we want to set update to true, so we can type within curly braces update true. Now the reason we've called an anonymous function here rather than just firing set item data is because we're using params within this method, and it'll continuously loop if we don't use the anonymous function format. I'll just console log item data update just to see what happens once we do click on our update button. We'll save this, go back to our browser. Currently displaying false. If we hit the update for caret, we've got true. So I'll get rid of that for now. So again, once we've hit this button, it's going to set this to true, which will give us the ability to determine what item data is set to. So if we type item data dot update, if item data dot update is true, we want to return a new form that will allow us to change the name of that item. But if it is false, we want to display the button in order to switch this value to true. So item data dot update is true. We want to display a div I've made a mistake here. This should be colon and this should be question mark. If item data dot update is true, it'll display this div. If it's false, it'll display this button. I'm going to create another div. I'll leave this empty just for a minute. I want to add another button and I'll just display an X just so we know that it'll get rid of this section of code in place of this. We want an on-click command. When it is clicked, we want to run an anonymous function. Like down here, we'll set the data. Set item data. And we want to update is false. And just down here, I'm just going to put this in a pair of curly braces. I'll save this. We'll go back to our browser. If we click update, we see it switched back to our X because as we've clicked the button here, we've set update to true, which will then display this content. And if we click on this again, we've set the updates to false, which by this will then revert back to our original button. Now we need to add a text input in order to update the name of our item. We'll add our form here. With an input, with a text input, which will be similar to the last one we created. We could store this in a separate component and use it over both the items and the string input components, but I won't do that for now, just to keep things simple. The type will be new name. The placeholder will set to change name. The name will be new name. The value will be equal to new name, which will be a variable which we gather from our state. We'll set that in a second. and onChange will be equal to a function called onChange, which we'll add in a moment. So back in our state, we need to set what the value is going to be. So we'll add a comma here and type new name and set this equal to an empty string. Now, rather than having to call item data new name, we can peel off new name from item data by typing const within curly braces new name is equal to item data. So basically what this does, it'll access item data, find whatever's called new name, and set a variable to that value. So this is the equivalent of saying new name. So we've got what our value will display determined by our state. We now need to create our Unchanged Handler. So we'll create another function which will take in an event, and then we're going to set item data unwrap our item data state. Within square braces we need e.target.name. We need the value of e.target.name, which is new name. And then we need to set that to whatever the value of our form hold, whatever the value of our input holds. So e.target.value. And I'll just log out the item data.new name whenever we make a change within our input form. I'll save this and we'll go back to our browser. I'll hit update, and as you can see, we've got a new input for whatever we want to change the name of our item to. I'll open up a console as well. And we've got the log here that is constantly updating whenever we change whatever we've typed into the input box. Now we need to determine what's going to happen once we've submitted this form. So we'll need an additional button in order to submit the form, which I'll place under the input. I'm going to use an input here with the type of submit, and the value of the input will be update name. Put a slash here. I'll save this, go back to our browser. When I hit update, we've then got our text input and the update button for updating the name of the item. this form needs instructions of what to do once it's been submitted. So once it has been submitted, we're going to we are going to run the function of onSubmit, which we will create up here. Which will be a new function. This will also take an event. We need to prevent the default actions for when we submit, which will be the re-rendering of the component. Prevent default. From there we will log the event.target just to make sure everything's running correctly. We'll go back to our browser after we've saved this. We can just refresh that, click update, type in, let's say _to update, and we're logging out the event or whatever the form contains with this line of code. So once we've submitted, we're accessing this function. What we want to do now is call our route to update our item name. I'm going to go back to our list.index, and I'm going to add the function to do that here. And then I'm going to pass it into props so item can access it. We've got update items here. This will be update item. So as long as we don't confuse them, we'll be okay. Update item will take in the item ID as well as the new name. We've already imported Axios, which we'll be using to make our API call, and this request will be a put request. We'll specify the route we want to use, which is API items, which will access within our backend API items. And the puts request. So this requires a name within the body and also an ID within the parameters. So this will be the new name that we have to include in the body, and this will be the item ID that we have to append to our route in order to access a specific item. So add item ID, and the second argument will be specifying what's going to change, and then setting that to new name. After we've made this request, if it's successful, we want to then update all items, which will be this function, in order to refresh the list of what we have pulled from the database in order to display it. Now, whenever we create an item, we need to send update item via props to the item component. So we can type update item to give it a name, to give the name to a prop, and then we can send the update item function. Now we have access to the update item function in our items props. We can go back to our onSubmit function and utilize it. We need to send the item ID, and if we remember before, we were sending the entirety of the item object to the item prop, so we have access to the ID within that based on our model. We have access to name, date, and also the ID that's generated when we create the item. So here we'll set the first argument to props.item _ID. Now for the second item, we've set what we want to change the name of the item to in our inputs, which we've stored up here. So we can type item data dot new name. We still got to add one more thing to our onSubmit function, but I'll just save this for now. I'll save the list. We'll go back to our browser. So we can click update to update the caret item. We'll call this caret2. I'll open up a console. I'll hit update name. Now we've updated the name to caret2. We'll go back to our database. I'll hit refresh. Our database has been updated. Now what we want to do is, once we've updated the name, we want this to revert back to this state automatically. And that's just a matter of, within our onSubmit function, typing set item data and setting update to false. I'll save that. Go back to our browser. I'll give this a quick refresh. Update. We'll go back to naming it caret. Hit update name, and as you can see, the list has been re-rendered, and we've also closed down the functionality to update the name. Now we can focus on adding our delete functionality within our React frontend. This will involve clicking a button that will fire a function that will call our routes and the delete, that will call the delete routes, and then re-rendering the list in our front end. We'll go to items and we'll add a delete button just under the name of each of our items. We'll house the button in a div and then we'll define our button. The text will display delete. I'll save this, go back to our front end, and we've got a delete button for each entry in our list. When the button is clicked, we want it to fire a function. And the function that we'll be using will be passed as props from our list component when we render each item from our map. So for now, we haven't created our delete item function yet, so we'll stay in list and we'll put it under update items, const delete item. Delete item will require the ID of the respective item that we want to delete. We'll make an Axios call. The type delete. The route will be API/items, and then we'll append the item ID to that route. We'll go back to our API. So now the ID that we've appended to this route will be usable under params ID, so we can find that item, and then that item will be deleted. And again, I've added this. I'm not entirely sure that's necessary, but it will be deleting that item by that ID. And then it will return what item has been deleted in JSON format, which we probably won't be using on the front end, but it's handy to have that anyway. So after we've deleted the item, we'll then res as a parameter, and then we'll run update item again to re-render the list, which should hopefully now not be displaying the deleted item. Now that we've created the delete item function, we can go back to item and pass that as a prop. I'll just shift our item component over to this side via a prop to the item component. And when we hit the delete button, we're going to call that function. So we want to call props.delete item. And then we want to add item ID as an argument, which we can access via props.item._ID. I'll save this and I'll go back to our list and save that. I'll make sure I've got my local database up and running. We'll try to delete tomato. I'll hit the delete button for tomato I've made a typo here. Delete item. I've made a typo also in the delete item. That should have a / because that was appending straight to item rather than /item. This needs to be update items, which I warned you against before, to not get that confused with that. So I've made the mistake that I warned you about, and yeah. I'll save this. I'll hit the delete button for tomato, and now as you can see, we've gotten rid of the tomato item. We'll go back to our database. The tomato item isn't displaying. I'll delete pair as well. Refresh. And now we have a fully functional delete button with a list that updates when we do delete an item. Now we have all of our CRUD functionality working in both the back end and the front end. We'll just quickly go over what we've achieved so far. We created our API that uses specific routes for everything we want to achieve. We can test that our route is working. We can get an item by ID. We can get all items in the database. We can post an item in order to add an item to the database. We can update our item using put, and we can also delete. We have tested all those routes with Postman, and we are using Axios to perform our route calls for whatever data we require. Currently we are storing all of our data in a local database, unless of course you're using Mlab to host your database. From here we'll go back to a browser and we'll go back to our Mlab account and sign in. Now we want to start preparing our code for when we deploy to Heroku. We're not going to use our local database setup for the database when we deploy to Heroku. We are going to use our Mlab account and database. So we need to add the code that will config the Mlab database for when we do deploy to Heroku. We'll close all this down and we'll open up our config file and our db.js. We'll just run over what we've got so far. We're defining a variable and we're setting that variable to the Mongo URI. Key value pair. In order to create a database connection, we define a function which is asynchronous, which we'll call Mongoose, which is a package that we've imported to connect based on the Mongo URI key value pair. We're setting some configuration here, and if everything is successful, we'll log a message of Mongo connected. Again, this will connect to our local instance of the database we've set up. Now what we want to do is is to determine whether or not our app is in production mode and configure the database connection accordingly. We'll use this for when it is not in production mode, and if it is, we'll set a different connection URI to connect to our Mlab database. To do this, we'll need to determine if we are in production mode. So to do that, we'll create an if statement, process.env.node_env is explicitly equal to production. So if this is set to production, which it will be once we've deployed to Heroku, then DB will be set to go to database access. When we go to database access, we've got the username of our database defined here, which we set up before. If you don't have a database user, just hit the add new database user and run through the steps to define one. We can go back to clusters and hit connect. We'll select connect your application. Now here we've got the connection that we need. I'm just going to copy this, Control C, and within our DB variable we'll set it to what we've just copied. Now here, as we're going to upload this to GitHub as well as Heroku, we don't want our password for our database user to be displayed. We also don't really want the database name to be displayed either. So what we want to do is define our username, our password, and the database name with variables that we can set within Heroku once we've deployed our app to it. So I'm going to delete the username, and then I'm going to append process.env.mongodb_username, and then add the addition sign on the end of that. So currently this string is going to have our username for the database user appended to this, and we'll set what this value holds once we've deployed to Heroku. We're going to do the same for password. Make sure you've got the colon still there. We'll delete that. Add two plus signs, and then within the middle we'll type process.env.mongodb_password. And finally, the database name. For me, it's my first database. I'm going to delete this again. Add two plus signs, and within the plus signs I'm going to type process.env.mongodb database name. I'll just run over this to make sure everything's correct. So once we've deployed to Heroku, this line of code should be run rather than this. We'll finish our if statement by typing else. If process.env.node env does not equal production, then we'll revert to our localhost database. From here, we're going to commit our new code to our local repository. We're going to then try and deploy onto Heroku, and from there, if everything is successful, we'll deploy our code to GitHub as well. Firstly, I just want to change the file name of React_boilerplate to MERN boilerplate. Now we'll probably have to close down our command prompt and server. So I'll just Control-C to cancel the server. I'll go to File Explorer, find the folder of our project. I'll just close down Atom for now. I'll make sure we're not in this file directory and just move back one space within the directory. I'll go to File Explorer, I'll find the project file and I'll hit rename. So now I've renamed from React_boilerplate to MERN_boilerplate. I'll copy the path. I'll cd back into that directory. I'll type atom space full stop to open atom within that directory. I won't restart the server again because if we're deploying to Heroku, that's a bit pointless. I'll open up a new command prompt. I'll cd into our project directory. Now, as I've downloaded this from GitHub, I'll have to reinitialize our repository. So I'll type git init. Now I can git add all. I'll type git status. It looks like our git ignore files are working correctly, and we've added all of our files that aren't included in the git ignore file. I'll commit this, git commit, with a message MERN boilerplate deployment. And from here, I'll go back to Heroku via the browser. Now I'm going to create a new Heroku app. Just give it a name. Just leave the region as United States and create app. Again, we've got our Heroku instructions. We'll log in now. So we've logged in, we've initialized our Git repository. We'll set our Heroku repository using these instructions. We've added, we've committed, and now hopefully we just push to Heroku. We're most likely going to get some errors here. We're going to need to configure our Mlab database slightly in order to accept IP addresses from Heroku. And we're also going to need to set those variables defined here within Heroku. So our deployment is complete. We'll go back to our browser and we'll see what kind of errors we've received. Here's our newly created project. We'll click Open App. Now, we can go back to our command prompt and we can type Heroku Logs tail. We'll go back to our project on Heroku. We'll first start by going to settings and setting our config variables. Now what we want to do is we want to set all three of these to have the relevant data that is required to complete our URI to connect to our Mlab database. So I'll copy that and paste that as the key. I'll go back to Mlab and log in. I'll go to database access, and that is the user I'll be using. Yours might be different depending on whatever you named yours. Back over to our config variables. I'll paste that in and then I'll add that. So now we have process.env.mongodb underscore username set. I'll jump ahead to mongodb underscore db name. I'll copy that, paste that as the key, and the value is going to be whatever the database name is. For me, it was my first database. To get the name of your database, go to clusters, and the name should be displayed here. This is from the previous tutorial where I've added carrots into this database. So I'm just going to type my first database. Here. I'll add that. Back to our code, we just have to add the password now. I'll copy that. I'll paste that in the key, and then I'll add my password for the user of the database. Now with our variables added to the Heroku deployment, we also need to go to network access within Mlab. Now we have to allow certain IP addresses to be able to access the database on the Mlab server. So I'm going to hit add IP address, and then I'm going to type 0.0.0.0/0. Now this will allow access from anywhere. So basically we could have just hit that and confirmed. Now we've included this IP address, which will allow all IP addresses to access the app. You'll probably want to change this to specific IP addresses if your app is something that needs security. But for right now, as this is just a tutorial to get us up and running, then this will be fine for now. I'm going to go back to Heroku and I'll open this app up again, and as you can see, we now have our app up and running. Now we'll try to add a new item to our list, which will hopefully store within our Mlab database. We've got one entry here. We'll hit add, and we've got tomato displaying. We'll go back to our database. We'll refresh. And we now have our added item displaying on our Mlab database. Now this could use a bit of CSS styling, but I'm going to leave that for a different video. I want to get all the boilerplate for CSS up and running simultaneously, utilizing Sass and frameworks like Bootstrap and Font Awesome. So I'm just going to leave this for now. I'll save it to a GitHub repository. I'm going to go to GitHub, go to repositories and create a new repository. I'll call this MERN Boilerplate. I'll go back to the code. I'll open the README file. I've updated this before. Type whatever you wish. If you're working from the previous tutorial and you didn't have to download this code, then I think you can pretty much just push the newly updated local repository to GitHub by using git push u origin main. But if, like me, re-downloaded the React boilerplate repository, then you'll have to set the git repository using this. copy that. I'll paste that. Change the branch. Or push. And just a side note, if you want to push to Heroku again, you may have to change where it says master to main to deploy to Heroku in the future. Go back to GitHub and that is our new GitHub repository. Next, we'll be working on implementing CSS styling using Sass and Font Awesome, Bootstrap, and a few other tweaks to our boilerplate code.